vast field stretched endlessly under the sky, where drifting white clouds cast slow-moving shadows over the golden grass. A soft breeze rustled through the land, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine from the distant tree line. The setting was tranquil, untouched, yet something felt deeply wrong. A roar shattered the silence. It wasn't the sound of dominance. It wasn't the deep, resonant call of a grizzly marking its territory. It was raw, pained, desperate. Daniel Carter froze. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as his gaze locked onto the sight before him. Just ahead, struggling against a cruel grasp of rusted barbed wire, lay a massive grizzly bear. Its powerful body trembled with exhaustion. Its thick brown fur stained with streaks of blood where the jagged metal had sliced into flesh. The more it thrashed, the deeper the barbs dug in. The ground beneath it was disturbed and smeared with dirt and blood, telling the story of its agony. Daniel inhaled sharply. The animal was trapped, helpless, dying. And yet, it wasn't alone, for more grizzly bears stood just beyond the clearing. They were watching, silent, unmoving, their deep, intelligent eyes locked onto him. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Why weren't they running? Why weren't they attacking? They were waiting. But waiting for what? Daniel Carter was not the kind of man one expected to see alone in the Montana wilderness. At 38 years old, he was a respected wildlife conservationist, known for his deep knowledge of grizzly behavior and his work in preserving their habitats. He had spent years studying them from a distance, tracking migration patterns, installing trail cameras, advocating for better wildlife protection policies. But never had he been this close, and never had he seen bears acting like this. He wasn't an adventurer. He wasn't the type to live off the land or wrestle nature. His world was made of scientific journals, research papers, and controlled field studies. Yet today he stood here, far from the safety of his office, his polished boots sinking into the earth, facing a situation he never imagined. What started as a simple expedition to track deforestation's impact had turned into something else entirely. And now he had a choice to make. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. If he turned around and left, he'd be safe. But the bear wouldn't survive. If he tried to free it, he could be mauled in the process. The trapped bear was in pain, wounded. A bear in pain was unpredictable. Even a dying grizzly still had the strength to kill a man in seconds. But the other bears, they weren't acting normal. They weren't charging. They weren't fleeing. They stood still, almost as if they were waiting for him to do something. Daniel swallowed. The weight of their gaze sent a chill down his spine. If he moved wrong, if he made the wrong choice, he wouldn't walk away from this. He took a slow step forward. The wounded bear growled low and deep, its ears flicking back. Warning. Daniel stopped, raised his hands. "Easy, big guy," he whispered, voice barely above the wind. The bear's breathing was ragged. Its body tense but didn't move further. Daniel cautiously assessed the situation. The wire was wrapped tightly around its front and hind legs. Someone had set up a fence here long ago, probably a cattle barrier that had been abandoned for years. The bear must have wandered in, not realizing the danger until it was too late. Now, every movement only made it worse. If Daniel didn't act soon, the bear could bleed out. Or worse, if it freed only one limb, it might have just enough strength left to attack. His fingers curled into fists. He couldn't leave it like this. Daniel reached into his backpack. Slowly, deliberately, his fingers brushed against the steel handle of his wire cutters. He always carried them for environmental cleanup missions, cutting old fencing, removing dangerous traps. But he had never used them on anything this extreme. His stomach twisted. He had no backup, no team, no gun, no way to call for help. This was insane. And yet, the four watching bears still hadn't moved. Their eyes were locked onto him. Daniel exhaled. This was a gamble. He crouched down. His hands were steady, but his pulse hammered against his ribs. The wounded grizzly flinched, its muscles twitching violently. Daniel froze. He could see the fear in its eyes, the uncertainty. He wasn't just gambling with his own life. He was gambling with the trust of an apex predator. The bear's breathing slowed, and then, against all odds, it stopped struggling. Daniel swallowed hard. It was letting him try. Carefully, he brought the cutters to the first strand of barbed wire. The metal was thick, rusted, stubborn. He squeezed hard. The blade bit in. Snap! The first wire split apart. A deep shudder ran through the bear's massive frame. But it didn't move. Daniel exhaled. One down. He reached for the next one. Snap! Snap! With every cut, the tension in the air thickened. And still, the other bears just watched, their expressions unreadable, their presence unnerving. Daniel didn't understand, but something inside him whispered. They were waiting for something. What exactly, he didn't know. And then, just as he reached the final wire, the bear lifted its head and looked straight into his eyes. There was something there, something he couldn't explain. And Daniel knew in that moment, everything was about to change. The final wire snapped. The moment the last strand of barbed wire fell away, Daniel barely had time to react. The grizzly lurched forward. Daniel stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. Was it attacking? No. The bear didn't charge, didn't growl, didn't swipe at him with claws that could tear through flesh in an instant. Instead, it did something Daniel never expected. It simply stood there. Blood dripped from its wounds, its legs trembling from exhaustion. But its massive frame remained eerily still. Its dark eyes, so deep, so intelligent, locked onto Daniel, unblinking. A silent moment stretched between them. And then, just as Daniel thought it would collapse, the bear did something that sent a shiver down his spine. It took a step back, not forward, not toward him, back, as if giving him space, as if acknowledging him. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. This wasn't normal. A bear, especially one that had just been trapped, wounded, and vulnerable, should be unpredictable. It should either run or retaliate. But this one, it was watching him, almost as if it understood. Daniel exhaled slowly, his body tense, ready to move at the first sign of aggression. The 4 other grizzlies, who had been standing still this entire time, shifted, not in a way that suggested they were about to attack. No, they were waiting for something. Daniel swallowed. His instinct screamed at him to back away, to put distance between himself and these wild predators. But something held him there. Curiosity, and something else. The injured bear finally broke eye contact. It lowered its head, sniffing the ground, then turned, slowly, carefully, toward the others. The largest bear in the group stepped forward. A massive male, likely the dominant one. Its dark fur rippled with muscle as it closed the distance between them. Daniel held his breath. Was this it? Was the real danger about to start? But instead of fighting, instead of asserting dominance, the larger bear did something that made Daniel's skin prickle with disbelief. It leaned in and nuzzled the injured bear's face. Not an attack, not a challenge, but something else entirely. Something Daniel had never seen in all his years of studying these creatures. It was comfort. It was gratitude. The air around him felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. Daniel took an unconscious step back, and that's when the large bear turned its head and looked at him, really looked at him. Daniel's stomach tightened. What was happening? He was used to observing animals, studying them from afar, but this wasn't distant. This wasn't scientific. This was something primal, something ancient. The bear blinked once. Then, without warning, it let out a deep rumbling sound. Not a roar, not a growl. Something softer, deeper, almost like a call. Daniel had never heard anything like it before. And whatever it meant, the other bears understood. Because one by one they turned away from him. The injured bear, now supported by the larger one, took a few shaky steps. Its legs wobbled, but it kept moving. And just like that, they started walking, away from him, back into the wild. Daniel stood frozen, watching their massive forms disappear into the trees. What had just happened? He had expected chaos. He had expected survival instincts to kick in. Instead, he had witnessed something else entirely. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A connection. A decision. The bears had made a choice. They had trusted him. And for the first time in his career, Daniel felt something shift inside him. He had spent his life studying these animals, learning their behaviors, advocating for their protection. But in all his research, in all his years of academic study, nothing had prepared him for this moment. Because today, he hadn't just observed. Today, he had been seen. And somehow, in a way he couldn't quite understand, he had been accepted. The forest was eerily quiet now. Daniel's heartbeat finally began to slow, but his mind was still reeling. What had he just experienced? Slowly, he let out a breath, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He needed to document this. He needed to write it down, analyze it, understand it. His backpack lay on the ground where he had dropped it. He reached for it, pulling out his journal and flipping to a fresh page. But before he could write a single word, a sound made him freeze. A deep, guttural growl, not from where the bears had disappeared. From behind him, Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned his head, and his stomach dropped. Standing just a few feet away was another grizzly. This one was different. Its fur was darker, almost black. Its body was leaner, its eyes sharper. And unlike the others, this one didn't look at him with curiosity. It looked at him with hunger. Daniel's breath hitched. This was no peaceful moment. This was something else entirely. The bear took a step forward. Daniel's pulse skyrocketed. He had no time to think, no time to analyze. This wasn't the same kind of encounter. This was a predator. And right now, he was prey. Daniel's breath came in short, shallow bursts. The grizzly in front of him was different from the others. It wasn't waiting. It wasn't watching. It was hunting. Daniel had spent years studying bear behavior, but right now, knowledge meant nothing. Facts and theories wouldn't save him. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he knew better. Running meant death. A grizzly could reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour. It would catch him in seconds. Daniel forced himself to stay still. His hands trembled at his sides, but he didn't move. He didn't even breathe too hard. The bear took another step forward. Its eyes locked onto him, dark and unreadable. Daniel's mind raced. Why was this one different? Had it been drawn by the scent of blood? The injured bear he had freed had left a trail. Maybe that had triggered something in this predator's instincts. Or maybe it had been watching the entire time. Daniel's stomach twisted at the thought. The others had accepted him, had even shown gratitude. But this one saw weakness, saw an opportunity. Daniel had no weapons, no way to defend himself. His only chance was to make himself seem bigger, more dominant. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his arms, spreading them wide. He straightened his back, standing as tall as he could. Then in a firm, unwavering voice he spoke. "Hey!" The bear didn't react. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears. "Hey! Get out of here!" Still no reaction. The bear's muscles tensed. Daniel's skin prickled. It was going to charge. His heart pounded against his ribs. If it charged, he had seconds to react, seconds to survive. He swallowed hard. Every fiber of his being screaming for a miracle. And then, a deep, rumbling sound cut through the silence. Not from the dark-furred grizzly. From behind it, Daniel's eyes widened. Stepping out from the trees was the massive grizzly from before, the one that had comforted the injured bear. The leader. It moved with quiet, deliberate strength, its heavy paws pressing into the earth. And as it approached, the dark-furred grizzly hesitated. Daniel saw it then, the shift, the flicker of uncertainty in the predator's eyes. It wasn't the dominant one anymore. The leader stopped just a few feet away, and then, without warning, it let out a sound, a low, deep growl, not aggressive, not hostile, a warning. The dark-furred bear stiffened. For a long, tense moment, it didn't move. Then it took a step back. Then another, and then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Daniel exhaled shakily, his knees nearly giving out beneath him. He was still alive. He looked up at the massive bear in front of him. It was watching him again, not with hunger, not with fear, but with something else, something Daniel couldn't explain. The bear huffed, then turned. It didn't walk away immediately. Instead, it looked back once, as if making sure Daniel understood. Then, just like before, it vanished into the forest. Daniel stood frozen, his breath coming in uneven gasps. What had just happened? The bears had saved him. Not just once, twice. Daniel had spent his life believing that humans were outsiders in the animal world, that nature operated by its own rules, without sentiment. But today, those beliefs had been shattered. Today, he had been protected, accepted, and deep in his gut, he knew one thing for certain: this would change everything. The forest was silent, except for the whispering wind rustling through the trees. Daniel stood there, his breath still unsteady, his body tense from the encounter. He had come face to face with death, but something impossible had happened. He had been spared. His mind replayed the moment over and over again. The Grizzlies had protected him. The leader had stepped in, issuing a silent command that had forced the aggressive bear to retreat. It had been more than instinct, more than dominance. It had been a choice. Daniel exhaled shakily, pressing a hand against his chest. His heart was still pounding, the weight of the moment settling deep within him. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of this forest before nightfall. But then, a sound, a slow, heavy movement from behind him. Daniel turned sharply, his body tensing again. The injured bear, the one he had freed from the barbed wire, was standing just a short distance away. Its massive frame was still battered, the wound on its leg still fresh, but its posture was strong. Steady. Daniel held his breath. It was watching him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them felt charged, as if something invisible passed between them. Then, the bear did something that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. It took a step closer, not in aggression, not in fear, but in recognition. Daniel's throat tightened. This wasn't normal. Wild animals didn't behave like this. He should have been a forgotten figure, a moment in the bear's life that had passed. Instead, it was standing there, watching him, acknowledging him. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. Should he move? Should he back away? Before he could decide, the bear did something even more unexpected. It lowered its head slightly, not in submission, not in weakness, but as if it was saying something. Daniel had spent his entire career studying animal behavior, but no textbook, no research paper, no documentary had ever prepared him for this. This was something deeper, something unspoken, a silent bond. Daniel felt his chest tighten. His whole life, he had seen animals as creatures of instinct, driven by survival. He had respected them, admired them, but he had never truly understood them. Not until now. His fingers twitched at his sides. Carefully, cautiously, he took a single step forward. The bear didn't flinch. Another step. Still, it held its ground. Daniel could see every detail of its face now. The deep brown of its eyes, the dry blood on its fur, the powerful rise and fall of its chest as it breathed. And then, the bear let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, not a warning. Something softer. Something Daniel had never heard before. His stomach tightened. This was real. This wasn't just his imagination. The bear was communicating with him. The air between them was heavy, charged with something indescribable. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the bear stepped back. It turned, took a few steps toward the trees, then paused. It looked back at him. One last time. Daniel swallowed hard, his vision blurring for reasons he couldn't explain. Then, without another sound, the bear disappeared into the wilderness. Daniel stood there, unmoving, his entire body buzzing with adrenaline and something else, something heavier. Gratitude. He had just witnessed something extraordinary, something no one would believe. He had saved a bear, and in return, it had acknowledged him. The weight of it all pressed against his chest. His entire life had been built around understanding animals. But today, he had learned something no book had ever taught him. Animals didn't just survive. They felt, they remembered, and sometimes they thanked you. Daniel wiped a shaky hand across his face. He needed to leave before nightfall, but something inside him refused to move just yet. He turned his gaze to the forest. to the place where the bear had disappeared. Would it remember him? Would it ever seek him out again? The thought sent a strange warmth through him. Maybe, maybe not. But one thing was certain. This moment would stay with him forever. This wasn't just an encounter. It was a story that needed to be told. Not for fame, not for recognition, but for them, for the world to see what he had seen, to understand what he now understood. That wild animals weren't just dangerous beasts. They were something more, something deeper. Daniel took a final, deep breath. Then, with the sun dipping lower in the sky, he turned and started the long journey back. He had come to forest, expecting nothing more than another routine study. But he was leaving with something far greater, something life-changing, something no one would ever forget. The evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the vast wilderness. The air was cool now, the scent of pine thick in the atmosphere. Daniel's boots crunched against the forest floor as he made his way through the trees, his mind still trapped in the moment that had just unfolded. He had saved a bear's life, and in return, the bear had given him something he could never explain: recognition, acknowledgement, gratitude. But as he walked, something inside him still felt unsettled. Was that truly the end of it? Or was there more? Daniel's cabin wasn't too far now, just beyond the river bend. The thought of warmth and rest was comforting, but another feeling crept beneath it. A strange reluctance to leave this place, as if something unfinished remained in the air. And then, a sound, a deep low growl. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks. His pulse quickened as he turned his head slowly, scanning the dimming forest. The sound had come from behind him, from the direction he had just come. His breath hitched. His fingers instinctively tightened around the straps of his backpack. Was it the same bear? Or another? His instincts screamed for him to keep moving. But something deeper, something unexplainable, made him stay. He turned around. The trees stood still. The wind whispered through the leaves. Everything was quiet. And then a shadow moved. Emerging from the trees, large and powerful, was the grizzly bear he had freed. Daniel's stomach clenched. It was back, and it wasn't alone. From behind it, another bear appeared. Then another, and another. A slow, eerie shiver crawled up Daniel's spine as he took an unconscious step back. The entire group of grizzlies was standing before him now, their massive forms blending into the darkening forest. They were watching him, not with aggression, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Daniel's throat tightened. Why were they here? Why had they followed him? The bear he had saved took a step forward. Its deep brown eyes locked onto his. Daniel felt his body tense, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The bear stopped just a few feet away. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, something impossible happened. The bear let out a slow, deliberate breath. A deep, rumbling sound. Not a growl, not a warning, but something else. It was soft, almost gentle. And then, the other bears did the same. One by one, they exhaled, creating a chorus of low, steady breaths that sent a chill through Daniel's entire body. What was this? What were they doing? Then, suddenly, the lead bear lifted its head and let out a deep, powerful sound. A sound that sent vibrations through the very ground beneath Daniel's feet. A sound that felt ancient. A sound that felt ritualistic. The other bears followed, their voices rising into the air, blending into something haunting yet strangely beautiful. Daniel stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. They weren't growling. They weren't threatening him. They were acknowledging him. A shudder ran through his entire body as the truth settled in. This was their way of saying something, their way of honoring him. It was gratitude, a ceremony, a moment unlike anything he had ever imagined. Daniel's eyes burned as he swallowed hard. This was real. This was happening. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sounds faded. The leader, his bear, looked at him one last time. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it turned. One by one, the others followed. And just like that, they vanished into the forest. Daniel stood there, his breath shallow, his body trembling. The silence that followed was deafening. His entire world had changed in an instant, Nothing would ever be the same. For the rest of his life, he would carry this moment with him. This wasn't just an encounter. This wasn't just a rescue. This was proof. Proof that animals were far more complex than anyone truly understood. Proof that they felt, that they remembered, that they could express something beyond survival. Daniel exhaled shakily, wiping a hand down his face. He had spent his life searching for meaning in his work. Tonight, in the heart of the wilderness, he had found it. And as he turned, finally making his way home, one thought echoed in his mind. He had come to this forest as a scientist. He was leaving as something else entirely. A believer in the unspoken, in the unseen, in the undeniable bond between man and nature. And he knew, deep in his soul, this was only the beginning.